While some argue that assisted suicide can be a compassionate and humane option for those facing unbearable suffering, others believe it undermines the value of human life and could lead to potential abuse. As it respects human anatomy and dignity, relieves physical and emotional agony, and enables a peaceful and dignified death, assisted suicide should be recognized an accessible option for terminally ill people who are going through excruciating suffering. The topic of assisted suicide, commonly referred to as physician-assisted suicide or medical aid in dying, is extremely continuous and delicate. Many are opposed to such an idea as taking away human life, but many also do not understand the benefits to be able to even have a decision in this. First, let's look at the problem. Assisted suicide is the intentional ending of a person's life by a physician or other medical professional with the person's consent, usually to relieve suffering. Opponents of assisted suicide claim that it is unethical, breaches the sanction of life, and would endanger vulnerable individuals. Assisted suicide is still prohibited in many nations. From the Boston Globe in January of 2020, there was a statement that said, "Meanwhile, Second Thoughts Massachusetts, a group that opposes medical aid in dying, praised the judge's decision. That organization said they would be pleased that the ruling found any state doctor who prescribes a lethal dosage of drugs could be subject to prosecution for involuntary manslaughter." When veterans in Canada are offered euthanasia for PTSD, when people with disabilities are approved for hastened death because of a lack of affordable, accessible housing, and when young people with anorexia at their wits' ends are provided a prescription by physicians to die by suicide, we have to ask ourselves if this is even really a choice, said in the New York Times. There are also practical concerns surrounding the implementation of assisted suicide, such as ensuring that the decision to end one's life is truly voluntary and informed, and that proper safeguards are in place to prevent mistakes or abuses. Critics of assisted suicide argue that it could lead to a slippery slope where society begins to devalue the lives of those who are deemed to have a lower quantity of life. From the New York Times in September of 2022, given the fast growth of her cancer, my mother was close to her death, but in her opinion, not close enough. Who does it help if I die slowly? She wanted to know. She got her way, and for her, suicide became a victory. Since writing a book about my mother's death, I've received a lot of sad mail from people who were in my mother's situation but couldn't do what she did. Or worse, they tried to die without help and failed. Most just waited to die, often for years. For the most part, suicide deserves the bad reputation it has, but not for those who are near the end, suffering, and want mercy. For them, mercy is death. The prerequisites for assisted suicide vary by nation or state, but generally speaking, one must be terminally sick or suffer from a serious, incurable illness or condition that results in intolerable pain. The doctor or other medical professional's responsibility is to advise the patient about their alternatives for end-of-life care, including assisted suicide, and help them make their own decision. However, they are not permitted to give the patient the fatal medication themselves. Stated in the Scotsman of January of 2020, doctor-assisted suicide would fundamentally change the relationship between doctor and patient. It would diminish the value and worth of dying patients and would have unintended consequences for the frail and vulnerable in our society. Changing the law to permit assisted suicide would lead to the lives of those who are weak being valued less than those who are strong. It would pressure those who are terminally ill to end their own lives. It would inevitably be extended to cover those with non-terminal conditions. In the very few European countries which do allow assisted suicide and euthanasia, vulnerable people with dementia and depression have been killed. Supporters of assisted suicide contend that it is a human alternative for those who are in extreme pain and have little prospect of recovery, and that everyone has the right to decide how they want to live and how they want to die. I can't deny that I regret taking leave of life. I would be false and lying if I said otherwise, because life is great and we only have one, the letter said. But unfortunately, that's the way it went. Mr. Carboni battled on even as his health deteriorated, Miss Gallo said. Federico wanted to exercise his right to free choice in Italy, and he was aware that his resistance would be a right and a freedom exercise for everyone, she said. This was taken from the New York Times in June of 2022. We have now seen the reasons behind this issue. Let's move on to a solution to this problem. There is no use for putting someone through such brutality as them, making them stay in a life they no longer desire or are able to continue as a way to ease society's mind. There is free will in this world that has helped maintain the concept of each individual. The person must be cognitively capable of making their own decisions, and they must voluntarily and fully inform themselves before deciding to request assisted suicide. Also taken from the New York Times. In his farewell letter, Mr. Carboni told his friends and family not to be sad. With the Consequoni Association, we have defended ourselves by attacking, and we have attacked by defending ourselves. We have created a judicial milestone and a piece of history in our country, and I am proud and honored to have stood by your side, he wrote. Don't cry, he added. Now I'm finally free to fly wherever I want. Taken from the Globe and Mail in December of 2020, assisted suicide was sold initially as a sort of conditional right, like the right to drink or drive or vote, which could be limited to certain sorts of people. But the logic of assisted suicide does not permit it. It presents suicide not as a tragedy we should wish at all costs to prevent, but a blessing, a release from intolerable suffering. So much so that we should not merely allow people to end their own lives, but others to do so on their behalf, and not merely allow it, but require it, even subsidize it. So it is that, in the space of a few years, assisted suicide has gone from a crime to a right to a public service. There are many different factors that have played out with such a sensitive topic, but hopefully the societal norms for the preservation of life, even when it is no longer needed, can be turned over again. We have looked at the ethical and legal frameworks that regulate assisted suicide, as well as the arguments for and against it, and assessed the effects of this practice on people, society, and healthcare as a whole. The debate over assisted suicide is complex, and it is a topic that requires careful consideration and discussion from a variety of perspectives. Some argue that assisted suicide undermines the value of human life and the sanction of the medical profession, which is founded on the principle of preserving and improving health. The topic still states profound ethical, legal, and philosophical questions and continues to be a continuous issue that sparks intense debates around the world. People should have the right to control their own bodies and make decisions about a peaceful end of life for those who choose it, rather than being forced to endure prolonged suffering to their deaths.